You felt it before. You're standing in a strip mall in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, maybe in Ohio, maybe in California, maybe in the Texas Panhandle. And there it is. A narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a sandwich shop. A red and white sign. A window full of gadgets you don't entirely understand. And inside, the smell of warm solder and new plastic, and a man in a short-sleeved shirt who already knows exactly what you need before you've finished your sentence. You walked in for a 9-volt battery. You walked out an hour later with a pair of alligator clips, a coaxial splitter, a transistor radio kit in a white cardboard box, and a feeling, hard to name but unmistakable, that you had just been in the presence of something genuinely useful. A place that understood electricity the way a good hardware store understands timber. That was RadioShack. At its absolute peak, RadioShack operated over 7,000 stores in the United States alone. The company boasted, and it was not an empty boast, that 94% of all Americans lived or worked within 5 miles of one of their locations. In 1999, annual revenue crossed $4 billion. The company's private label electronics brand, Realistic, was manufactured on-site in Fort Worth, Texas, and shipped across the country. In quantities that rivaled the major Japanese manufacturers. RadioShack was the largest personal computer retailer in the world through 1982. It hired Bill Gates and Paul Allen to write software before anyone outside Seattle had heard their names. They survived the Great Depression. They survived the Second World War. They survived the Korean War slump and the fuel crisis of 1973, and the CB radio collapse of 1976 that left dozens of their competitors dead in the water. They survived the personal computer revolution, not merely survived it, they helped invent it. They adapted when leather goods companies were their parent, when CB radios were their product, when desktop computers were their future, when mobile phones were their last great hope. And then, after 94 years of selling, of soldering, of answering questions that nobody else had time to answer, RadioShack collapsed, not slowly, not gracefully. Twice in 2 years the company filed for bankruptcy. Thousands of stores shuttered. Tens of thousands of workers lost jobs they had held for decades. The red sign came down from strip malls across America, and nobody replaced it with anything that knew the difference between a capacitor and a resistor. How does the most recognized electronics store in the history of American retail end up bankrupt twice in 24 months? What happened inside those stores and inside those boardrooms that turned a 100-year institution into a cautionary tale? If you are finding this story as gripping as I am, drop a comment below right now. We want to know where you're watching from and whether RadioShack was part of your life. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. We publish these industrial documentaries every week, and this one is only the beginning. The answers when they come will not be simple, and they will not be comfortable. Chapter 1. A Basement on Brattle Street. The story begins not in Texas and not in the gleaming corporate campuses of the electronics age. It begins in a basement. The address was 46 Brattle Street, in the heart of downtown Boston, Massachusetts. The year was 1921. The space measured approximately 7,000 cubic feet, a single low-ceilinged room. Below street level, reached by a narrow staircase rented for $50 a month. The light was poor. The ventilation was minimal. And the two men who set up shop there were not businessmen in any formal sense. They were brothers who loved radio. Theodore and Milton Deutschmann were the sons of immigrants, young men who had grown up in New England during the earliest years of wireless communication. A time when picking up a transmission from another state felt like magic, and when building your own receiver from a kit of components was the closest thing a teenager in Boston could get to touching the future. In 1921, the radio world was young and chaotic and crackling with possibility. Vacuum tubes were expensive, antennas required calculation, and the equipment needed by serious ham radio operators, the coils, the condensers, the transformers, the headsets, was nearly impossible to find in any single place. Theodore and Milton Deutschmann decided to be that place. The name came from a suggestion by an early employee, Bill Halligan, a man who would later go on to found the Hallicrafters Radio Company. He proposed calling the shop RadioShack, borrowing the naval term for the small wooden structure on the open deck of a ship where the radio equipment was housed. It was where the ship's radio officer worked. It was where the signals came in from the outside world. The Deutschmanns thought that was exactly right. Their store would be the Radio Shack for every ham operator in New England. They were not wrong. The mail-order catalog they launched in 1939 reached customers across the country. By the late 1950s, Radio Shack had grown to a handful of stores clustered in the northeast of the United States and had become one of the leading mail-order distributors of electronic components for hobbyists. The basement on Brattle Street was long gone by then. But building something and running it profitably are not the same skill. By the early 1960s, Radio Shack was in serious financial trouble. Expansion had outpaced revenue. Receivables, money owed to the company by customers and suppliers, had piled up to almost $800,000 that the company could not collect. The business had 9 stores in the Boston area and was drifting toward insolvency. The brothers who had built it were exhausted. They were looking for a way out. The buyer who appeared in 1963 was not who they expected. He was not from the electronics world. He was from Fort Worth, Texas. He had grown up selling leather scraps to neighborhood children from his father's shoe findings shop. His name was Charles David Tandy. Chapter 2. The Leather Man and the Radio Shop. Charles Tandy was born on the 15th of May, 1918, in Brownsville, Texas. His father ran the Hinckley Tandy Leather Company in Fort Worth, a wholesale business that supplied leather to shoe repair shops and later to hospitals, army bases, and schools. Charles entered the business at the age of 12, selling leather scraps from his father's shop to teach other children how to make belts. He was not yet a teenager, and he was already a salesman. He graduated from Texas Christian University in 1940, spent 1 semester at Harvard Business School, and then joined the United States Navy when the war came. He served as a Supply Corps officer. It was there that he noticed something important. Wounded sailors were being taught knitting and needlepoint as recuperative therapy. Tandy watched them for a while. Tandy concluded that men who had spent their careers operating machinery and handling equipment would far rather work with leather. He set up a leathercraft program for the Navy's recuperating personnel. That instinct, the understanding that the right product placed in front of the right person at the right moment would define everything that came after. After the war, Tandy joined his father's business full-time. He shifted the company away from wholesale leather sales toward leathercraft kits aimed at hobbyists. By 1960, Tandy Corporation was publicly listed. Scout troops across America were making moccasins and coin purses from Tandy kits. The hobby market was booming. But Charles Tandy was restless. When he walked into RadioShack in 1963, what he saw was not a failing business. He saw a mailing list. He saw 100,000 names and addresses of people who cared deeply about electronics. He saw a distribution infrastructure, an established supplier network, and a product category, consumer electronics, that was about to explode. He paid $300,000 for the company. His staff thought he had lost his mind. Within 2 years, the RadioShack division was profitable. Tandy applied the same techniques that had worked for leathercraft: deep discounts and high turnover. He described his target customer with characteristic directness. "We're not looking for the guy who wants to spend his entire paycheck on a sound system," he said. "We want the guy looking to save money by buying cheaper goods." The kids aiming to win their science fair. The amateur radio operator who needed one specific coil at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. Within 10 years of that $300,000 purchase, Tandy Corporation was opening 2 new RadioShack stores every single working day. That is not a figure rounded for effect. That is the recorded rate of expansion. 2 stores a day, 5 days a week. The company was growing faster than almost any retail organization in American history, in strip malls and suburban shopping centers. The growth was systematic. It was relentless. By 1973, there were roughly 2,300 RadioShack stores in the United States. The gross profit margin held consistently above 50%, a figure that luxury goods companies would envy. And then came the CB radio. Citizens Band radio had existed since the 1940s, but it broke into American mass culture in the early 1970s with a force that nobody entirely anticipated. Truckers had been using CB to communicate on highways for years, but after the fuel crisis of 1973, when speed limits dropped to 55 miles per hour and truckers needed to warn each other about speed traps, CB radios became essential. The culture that grew up around them spread quickly. By 1975 and 1976, CB radio was not just practical equipment, it was a phenomenon. Television shows celebrated it. Popular songs were written about it. RadioShack was the place to buy them. In 1976, at the absolute height of the CB craze, the company's revenues from Citizens Band equipment alone were staggering. Every RadioShack store had a CB section. The stores smelled of warm electronics and new packaging, and the salesman could hold a conversation about antenna gain and wattage and skip distance that would last as long as the customer was willing to listen. It was the high water mark of what RadioShack had originally been designed to be. A place where ordinary Americans could engage with technology that was neither simple nor intimidating, just specific and knowable. Charles Tandy died in his sleep, in his Fort Worth home, on the 4th of November 1978. He was 60 years old. He had built a retail empire from a leather shop. He never saw what came next. Chapter 3. The computer nobody expected. Before Charles Tandy died, he had allowed himself to be persuaded of one more thing. Not by a salesman this time, but by an engineer, a quiet, methodical man named John Vincent Roach, who had joined the company in 1967 as a data processing manager. Roach had been looking at a machine called the MITS Altair 8800. It had appeared on the cover of Popular Electronics in January 1975, and it had caused a sensation in engineering circles. A real computer that a private individual could actually afford. It came as a kit. You programmed it by flipping physical switches. Don French brought the idea to Roach. What if RadioShack built a computer, not a kit? A complete assembled machine with a keyboard, a monitor, memory, and a programming language, all in a single box, ready to use the moment you lifted the lid. No company had done that. Not one. Roach presented the idea to Charles Tandy himself in January 1977. Tandy was skeptical. He agreed to build 3,500 units, exactly the number of RadioShack stores in operation at the time. To write the software, the company contracted a small firm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a two-man operation that had just moved up from nothing. The principals were Bill Gates and Paul Allen. The TRS-80 microcomputer system was announced at a press conference on the 3rd of August, 1977. The press, by and large, did not care. The major newspapers ignored it. The public was different. Within days of the announcement, RadioShack's switchboard was paralyzed. Over 15,000 calls came in from people trying to place orders. The machines were back-ordered for months. 1 in 3 products on a RadioShack shelf in the mid-1970s had been manufactured by a Tandy subsidiary. The vertical integration was absolute. John Roach was named the best chief executive in the industry. By 1981, RadioShack owned 40% of the domestic home computer market. 40%. The company was now the largest personal computer retailer on Earth. The headquarters in Fort Worth reflected the scale of what the company had become. In 1974, Tandy constructed the Tandy Center, twin office towers and a private subway that ran from the headquarters to the parking lots. By the mid-1990s, the company was at work on something even more ambitious. A 900,000 square foot campus on 38 acres along the banks of the Trinity River. It cost $200 million to build. The company that occupied it had 36,400 employees. The Realistic brand was manufactured in Tandy's own plants. The magnetic tape produced at the Realistic Super Tape facility competed directly with BASF and Maxell. 1 in 3 products on a RadioShack shelf in the mid-1970s had been manufactured by a Tandy subsidiary. The vertical integration was absolute. John Roach was named the best chief executive in the industry. The RadioShack of the early 1980s was the place where a generation of American engineers and programmers got their first encounter with serious computing. Kids who would go on to write code for the Internet. The company had positioned itself at the exact center of the American technological imagination. That was not an accident. It was 40 years of deliberate, methodical work. But 1982 was also the year the IBM personal computer arrived. Chapter 4: The Cracks in the Wall. IBM's PC changed everything. It did so completely. The IBM machine ran a different operating system, MS-DOS, and crucially, IBM licensed the design openly, which meant that any manufacturer could build a compatible machine. The TRS-80 ran none of it. By 1984, RadioShack's market share in personal computers had fallen from 19% to under 9%. The company had been the dominant force just 2 years earlier. Now, it was a niche player. The derisive nickname had already taken hold in computing circles. They called it the Trash 80. There were internal warnings. Former executives later described conversations about shifting to IBM-compatible machines. The response was that computer sales were to be kept deliberately below 10% because the margins were not good enough. The company's gross profit model could not be replicated in the IBM-compatible market. So, RadioShack retreated. Slowly at first, then completely. In 1993, the company stopped making its own computers entirely. What almost nobody outside the company knew was that they had become a manufacturer for others. Tandy was building IBM-compatible machines for AST Research, Digital Equipment Corporation, GRID Systems, and Panasonic. The manufacturing expertise was extraordinary, but the retail brand was being systematically divorced from it. When Roach retired in 1999, his successor, Leonard Roberts, had already begun steering the company toward a different future. Roberts was the man behind the slogan, "You've got questions, we've got answers." He believed, not unreasonably, that RadioShack's greatest asset was the knowledge of its staff. Saturday morning training sessions. Roberts was right about the asset. He was wrong about whether it could survive. In 1994, a company called Amazon opened for business in a garage in Bellevue, Washington. In 1995, RadioShack's website went live, but it could not process a single order. It offered store locations, that was all. The company that had mailed catalogs to 100,000 enthusiasts every year, the company that understood better than almost anyone how to reach a customer who wanted something specific. That company watched the internet arrive. The first RadioShack website capable of accepting a purchase order went live in 2000. Amazon had been selling books for 6 years by then. This was the first moment of irreversible damage. Those 6 years gave Amazon a head start. There was a second problem. The RadioShack of 1985 had been a place where a serious hobbyist could spend 2 hours exploring inventory. The components aisle alone was the reason an entire category of engineers came back. By the late 1990s, that inventory was shrinking. The company was rationalizing its stock, replacing components with higher-margin consumer products. The people who came in for a specific transistor started finding it missing. They did not complain loudly, they just stopped coming. And then, into this gathering crisis, a man arrived with a resume that contained 2 degrees he had never actually earned. This was the beginning of the end. Stay tuned for the second part, where we dive into the boardroom scandals and the final bankruptcy. Chapter 5. The Resume and the Wreckage. His name was David Edmondson, and he had been named Chief Executive of RadioShack Corporation on May 20th, 2005. Edmondson was 51 years old and had spent his entire career inside the company, rising from a sales role to head of the retail division to the top position. He was, by most accounts, personable and energetic. He believed RadioShack could be saved by pivoting aggressively into mobile communications, by signing long-term agreements with wireless carriers and becoming the destination store for cell phone purchases. The strategy was not entirely wrong. Cell phones were the dominant growth category in consumer electronics in 2005. RadioShack had signed contracts with Sprint and Singular, an 11-year deal with Sprint, a 10-year deal with Singular. And its stores were being converted floor by floor to accommodate wireless display cases and carrier kiosks. For a time, the foot traffic returned. Customers came in to upgrade their phones to add a data plan, to buy a car charger or a protective case. The numbers looked encouraging. What almost nobody knew at the time, certainly not the investors or the board, was that the operating costs were enormous. Signing up a single customer for a wireless contract took approximately 45 minutes of a sales associate's time. The paperwork, the credit checks, all of it turned RadioShack stores into something closer to a DMV office. The customers who had come in for a 9-volt battery stood in line behind people doing complicated cellular paperwork. Many of them left and did not come back. On the 20th of February 2006, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram published an investigation into Edmondson's educational background. The paper had discovered that Edmondson's official biography was false, which stated he held degrees in theology and psychology from Pacific Coast Baptist College, now known as Heartland Baptist Bible College, was false. He had attended the school for 2 semesters. The school had never offered a psychology degree, not once in its history. Edmondson resigned the same day the story ran. He had been CEO for exactly 9 months. The company's executive chairman, Leonard Roberts, issued a statement. "One of the most important things we have as a corporation," Roberts said, "is integrity and trust. We have to restore that back to the company." Roberts himself resigned 3 months later. The board then made its next decision, one that would accelerate the decline. In July 2006, RadioShack hired Julian Day as chairman and CEO. Day, 54, was a British-born executive who had previously served as CEO of Kmart, where he had led the chain through bankruptcy. He had a reputation as a cost-cutter, and that reputation was not wrong. 1 month after Day took the position, in August 2006, RadioShack laid off 400 corporate employees. The notification method chosen by Day's team was an email. 400 people, 1 email. The message told them they had been terminated. It arrived in their inboxes with no warning. One former employee described the feeling as being dismissed like a server notification. Another said simply, "They treated us like machines." Whatever institutional loyalty remained inside RadioShack after the Edmondson scandal largely evaporated in August 2006. The staff who stayed knew what they now knew. The company did not regard them as people. Under Day, operating costs were slashed. Stores were closed. For a brief period, the quarterly numbers looked better. But what Day was doing was not stabilizing RadioShack. He was burning the furniture to heat the house. By 2011, Day's strategy was visibly exhausted. Day retired. His successor was Jim Gooch. Gooch lasted 16 months. After Gooch came a rotating door of chief executives, each one inheriting a weaker company than the last. Chapter 6. The Numbers and the Silence. The facts of RadioShack's final years are not complicated. They are simply painful. In 2012, the company reported a net loss of $139 million. In 2013, the loss was $400 million. By 2014, RadioShack was losing money at a rate of $200 million per year in its mobility division alone. The total debt by 2014 was $1.2 billion. The company was, by any arithmetic, insolvent. Visit a RadioShack in 2013, and you would find a space that had once been expertly curated and now looked abandoned. The components section, the resistors, the capacitors, had been reduced to a single rack near the back of the store, the bins half empty, the labels faded. The cell phone display cases dominated the floor. The staff, once trained specialists in electronics, were now largely commission-driven phone salespeople who had been hired to push carrier contracts. The core customers, the makers and tinkerers, had already left. They had found their components on eBay, on Amazon, from specialist online retailers who stocked the exact parts that RadioShack had stopped carrying. They did not miss the stores. They missed what the stores had once been. In January 2014, RadioShack ran a television advertisement during the Super Bowl that was an act of corporate self-awareness arriving 10 years too late. In the ad, characters from 1980s pop culture walked into a RadioShack. The punchline was that RadioShack was being reborn. The public's reaction was mixed. The company had tried to rebrand itself as The Shack in 2009, a decision that was widely mocked before it was quietly abandoned. In 2014, the company's lenders refused to allow it to close more than 200 stores. The company had tried to shutter 1,100 stores. The banks said no. The leases were assets against which money had been borrowed. The company was trapped by its own financial architecture. On the 5th of February 2015, RadioShack Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the District of Delaware. Approximately 1,700 stores would close immediately. The remaining 2,400 would be sold to General Wireless and Sprint. The co-branded stores that resulted would have Sprint mini stores installed inside them. The news was covered extensively. In the electronics districts of Fort Worth, people gathered outside stores. Some of them took photographs. A few of them went inside and bought things. It was the last chance. The Sprint partnership did not work. Mobile phone sales continued to weaken. On the 9th of March 2017, General Wireless Operations filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time. Chief Executive Dean A. Rogers issued a statement thanking the staff for their relentless efforts. The staff in the remaining stores found out through news alerts on their phones. RadioShack was effectively over. Chapter 7. The Last Days and the Aftermath. The stores did not close all at once. They closed in batches over months, the way a fire burns out. When the closure finally happened, there was no ceremony. A sign went up in the window. The stock was liquidated at reduced prices. The shelves emptied. The sign came down. The Tandy Center Towers in downtown Fort Worth were converted to residential use. They are now called City Place and House Apartments. The subway that once carried Tandy employees is gone. The rink is gone. By 2017, RadioShack had approximately 70,000 employees at its peak. The number who lost jobs across the two bankruptcies certainly runs into the tens of thousands. These were not anonymous figures. In Fort Worth, the headquarters at 300 RadioShack Circle had already been sold. Tarrant County College had purchased the campus in 2008. Today, the address is 300 Trinity Campus Circle. The Tandy Center Towers in downtown Fort Worth were converted to residential use. They are now called City Place and House Apartments. The subway that once carried Tandy employees is gone. The rink is gone. By 2017, RadioShack had approximately 70,000 employees at its peak. The number who lost jobs across the two bankruptcies certainly runs into the tens of thousands. These were not anonymous figures. Michael Camp worked at a RadioShack store in Columbus, Ohio, for 11 years. He knew the specifications of every amplifier, every receiver. He described the experience as like losing a language. The realistic brand, RadioShack's private label audio equipment, once manufactured in Fort Worth, no longer exists as a functioning product line. The backbone of the company's identity is now the province of specialist online retailers. And on the internet, in forums frequented by ham radio operators and computer collectors, the discussion of RadioShack continues. They trade photographs. They remember the smell of the stores. The silence and what remained. You asked what really happened inside those walls. Here is the answer. And it requires more than one villain. The first villain was a decision made in the early 1990s. The management chose to exit the personal computer manufacturing business at the retail level. That was the moment when RadioShack began to separate itself from the frontier. The second villain was the 6 years from 1994 to 2000, during which RadioShack watched the internet arrive and chose not to connect its inventory to it. 6 years. They could not translate that expertise to the web. The third villain was David Edmondson. What he represented was a leadership culture in which self-promotion had displaced competence. The resume lie revealed what the institution had become: appearance over substance. The fourth villain was the financial structure, the loan agreements that prevented store closures, the hedge fund ownership that prioritized recovering capital over preserving the business. And there is an irony. RadioShack's greatest moment was made possible because Bill Gates and Paul Allen wrote the software. The technology that RadioShack helped bring to the world was the technology that unmade it. Where 300 RadioShack Circle once housed 3 buildings full of people who sold electronics, students now attend classes. The fountain still curves, the Trinity River still moves. The address has changed, the history has not. The RadioShack brand still exists technically. It was acquired in 2023 by the Unicommer Group, a multinational that operated franchises in Central America. The name survives. The institution does not. In the basements and garages of tens of thousands of American homes, there are component bins organized by type and value. The people who organized them learned that system at RadioShack. They learned it from a man who knew the inventory without consulting a screen, who understood that there is something satisfying about holding in your hand the exact piece that will make something work. That knowledge is still there, but RadioShack is not. If you watch this documentary to the end, thank you. Now we want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Did you ever work at RadioShack? Who do you hold responsible? The executives, the hedge funds, or the internet? Tell us in the comments. The debate belongs to you.